What starts as a night of humiliation for Daniel, a dedicated black waiter, turns into a story of redemption and inspiration when a shocking intervention from none other than Keanu Reeves changes everything. What will happen when an A-list celebrity steps in to confront injustice? Stay tuned to find out, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more unforgettable stories. The restaurant hummed with activity, its polished floors reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers hanging overhead. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the steady hum of conversation filled the air. At the center of it all was Daniel, a 28-year-old waiter with a calm presence and a winning smile. He moved with practiced grace, balancing plates of meticulously prepared meals while navigating the intricacies of fine dining etiquette. Daniel had been working at Elan, one of the city's most renowned restaurants, for 3 years. Though the pay barely justified the long hours and high demands, he took pride in his work. He had a knack for making diners feel special, no matter how wealthy or entitled they were. Tonight, as always, he carried himself with quiet dignity, his tailored uniform crisp and spotless. As Daniel approached table 14, his smile tightened. Seated there was Mr. Bradley, a regular known more for his arrogance than his loyalty. Bradley was in his early 50s, with a neatly combed head of silver hair and a smug expression that rarely wavered. His demeanor screamed privilege, and Daniel braced himself for another long night. "Ah, there he is," Bradley said, looking up from his phone with a dismissive glance. "Finally decided to show up." Daniel's grip on the notepad in his hand tightened briefly, but his voice remained even. "Good evening, Mr. Bradley. Welcome back to Elan. May I start you off with your usual wine selection?" Bradley smirked. "I'm sure you already know what I like, don't you? Or is that too much to expect?" The comment drew a slight chuckle from Bradley's guest, a younger man in a designer suit who seemed eager to impress. Daniel nodded politely, ignoring the thinly veiled insult. "Of course, sir. I'll have it brought out right away." As Daniel walked toward the kitchen, he caught snippets of whispered conversations from nearby tables. A couple at table 16 glanced toward Bradley with furrowed brows, clearly uncomfortable with his behavior. Daniel kept his head high, a habit he'd developed early in his career. His grandmother's voice rang in his memory, "Never let them see they've shaken you. Grace is your power." In the back, Daniel handed the wine request to a colleague. Another tough table asked Maria, a fellow waiter and one of his closest friends at Elan. Bradley, Daniel replied, as though the name alone explained everything. Maria rolled her eyes in solidarity. By the time Daniel returned to table 14 with the wine, Bradley had moved on to loudly critiquing the bread basket. "The sourdough? It's like chewing cardboard," he sneered, breaking off a piece and holding it up like evidence in court. Daniel remained unflappable. "I can request a fresh batch from the kitchen if you'd like, sir." Bradley waved him off. "Don't bother. I'm not paying to educate you people on what decent bread tastes like." Daniel felt a warmth rise in his cheeks but kept his composure. "Understood, sir. Let me know if there's anything else I can bring to improve your evening." Across the room, a lone diner seated at the farthest corner table watched the interaction closely. The man, wearing a simple leather jacket and dark jeans, seemed unassuming at first glance. Yet there was an unmistakable sense of calm authority in the way he observed the scene unfolding. Most patrons were too engrossed in their meals to notice him, but Daniel's poised handling of the situation hadn't escaped his attention. As the night wore on, Bradley's behavior escalated. He criticized the appetizer plating, complained about the temperature of the room, and loudly berated Daniel for being slow. Daniel's coworkers cast him sympathetic glances as he bore the brunt of the abuse, but he didn't let it show. His professionalism remained intact, though each comment chipped away at his resolve. Finally, Bradley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "This service," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "is unacceptable. I've had better at fast food joints. I don't know why I keep coming here." Daniel stood there, his notepad clenched behind his back. The restaurant grew quieter, the tension palpable. His voice, when he spoke, was steady. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Bradley. I'll inform the manager if there's anything we can do to meet your expectations." Bradley smirked again, clearly enjoying the attention. "You can start by finding someone who knows what they're doing. And don't expect a tip." As Daniel turned to leave, he caught the eye of the man in the corner. Their gazes met briefly. The man nodded ever so slightly, a gesture that felt strangely reassuring. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the night was about to take a turn he would never forget. The tension in the dining room was palpable, the air thick with unease. Though most patrons were doing their best to ignore Bradley's escalating behavior, whispers and side glances hinted at their discomfort. Daniel continued his rounds, checking on other tables with his trademark calm, but his chest felt tight. He had encountered countless difficult customers in his career, but Bradley always seemed to take pleasure in pushing boundaries. Maria, passing by with a tray of desserts, leaned in briefly. "Do you want me to swap tables with you? I can handle him." Daniel shook his head. "Thanks, Maria, but I've got it. He's not worth the fuss." Maria gave him a look of concern but nodded and moved on. It wasn't worth escalating things further. Daniel's method of maintaining composure often worked better than confrontation, even when it stung. Back at table 14, Bradley was laughing loudly at something his guest had said. Their conversation dripped with condescension, with casual remarks about standards and service that seemed aimed to remind everyone around them of their perceived superiority. Daniel approached with their main courses, setting each plate down with precision and care. Bradley inspected his filet mignon with theatrical disgust. "What is this?" he demanded, jabbing a fork into the meat. "I asked for medium rare. This is practically raw." Daniel glanced at the plate. The steak was cooked to perfection, its pink center exactly as ordered. "I apologize, Mr. Bradley. Would you like me to have the kitchen prepare a new one?" Bradley leaned back in his chair, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "Why should I have to wait while your kitchen fixes something they should have gotten right the first time?" The guest chimed in, smirking. "I mean, we're paying top dollar here. You'd think they'd hire people who can handle the basics." Daniel nodded politely. "I'll let the chef know. It'll be just a few minutes." He turned and walked away, ignoring the prickle of heat on the back of his neck. In the kitchen, Chef Lewis was already fuming. "That guy again?" the chef asked, barely looking up as Daniel relayed the complaint. Daniel nodded. "He says it's undercooked." Chef Louis barked out a laugh, holding up the steak thermometer as evidence. "Perfect medium rare, just like he asked." "Yeah," Daniel said with a faint smile. "But he's not here to enjoy the food, he's here to complain." The chef muttered something under his breath and reluctantly began preparing a new steak. Daniel took the moment to lean against the counter, steadying himself. He hadn't expected the evening to hit this level of intensity, but he couldn't let Bradley rattle him. Not now. As Daniel returned to the dining room, a commotion drew his attention. Bradley had pushed his chair back, loudly addressing a nearby table. "I'm just saying, if you're paying this kind of money, you'd expect at least competent staff," he declared, clearly angling to involve others in his tirade. The diners at the adjacent table exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. Maria shot Daniel a concerned look from across the room, but he shook his head subtly, signaling her to let it go. He approached Bradley again, balancing his tray with practiced ease. "Here's your replacement steak, Mr. Bradley. Please let me know if this is more to your liking." Bradley leaned forward, inspecting the new dish with exaggerated scrutiny. Then, in a move that drew audible gasps, he pushed the plate aside. "You know what? I've lost my appetite. Maybe if you people spent less time pretending to care about presentation and more time actually cooking, this wouldn't happen." Daniel inhaled deeply, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. I'll inform the manager if there's anything we can do to make this right." Bradley smirked, his voice rising. "Oh, you'll make it right. You can start by waiving my bill. I'm not paying for this disaster." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Daniel, who stood frozen for a moment before nodding. "I'll get the manager," he said quietly. As Daniel turned toward the back office, a figure rose from the corner of the room. The man in the leather jacket had been sitting quietly through the entire scene, his expression unreadable. Now he approached table 14 with a calm, purposeful stride. Bradley glanced up, clearly annoyed. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. The man, who Daniel now recognized as none other than Keanu Reeves, tilted his head slightly. "I think you've already helped yourself enough," he said evenly. His voice was low but carried enough authority to hush the room completely. Bradley blinked, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me." Keanu gestured toward Daniel, who was still standing nearby, unsure of what to do. "This man has been nothing but professional while you've gone out of your way to humiliate him. If anyone deserves an apology, it's him." Gasps rippled through the room as whispers started. Bradley's guest muttered, "Is that?" Keanu ignored the murmurs, his attention focused entirely on Bradley. "You don't need to pay for your meal tonight," he said, his tone firm. "Because I'll be covering it for him." He nodded toward Daniel, who felt a wave of disbelief and gratitude wash over him. Bradley's face turned red, his composure faltering. I don't need some celebrity lecturing me." Keanu raised a hand, silencing him effortlessly. "You've made your point, sir. Now it's time to leave." The silence in the room was deafening as everyone waited for Bradley's next move. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in time, every pair of eyes fixed on the confrontation. Bradley, visibly flustered, tried to regain his composure. "I don't need anyone telling me how to act," he sneered, though his voice carried less confidence than before. His gaze darted around the room, landing briefly on Keanu, who stood steady and unbothered, before flickering to the growing crowd of onlookers. Keanu remained calm, his hands resting loosely in his jacket pockets. "This isn't about me telling you how to act," he said, his voice firm yet disarmingly gentle. "It's about treating people with respect, something you've clearly forgotten tonight." Bradley's guest leaned closer, his tone a hushed whisper. Mr. Bradley, I think we should go." But Bradley wasn't ready to back down. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward, the clatter echoing across the room. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice trembling with indignation. "I'm the customer here. I have a right to complain when the service is subpar." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "A complaint is one thing. Humiliation is another." Daniel, who had been standing to the side, felt a mixture of relief and unease. He wasn't used to being at the center of this kind of attention, and while he appreciated Keanu's support, he wasn't sure how Bradley would react. The man's ego was clearly bruised, and bruised egos could be dangerous. The restaurant manager, a wiry man named Peter, arrived at the scene, his face pale but composed. "Mr. Bradley," he began, his tone placating, "if there's been a misunderstanding, we'd be happy to." "Misunderstanding?" Bradley snapped, rounding on Peter. "This establishment should be ashamed of itself. First, I get served by someone who doesn't belong here, and now this circus." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and a few diners visibly recoiled. Daniel stiffened, the weight of Bradley's words hitting him like a physical blow. He dealt with subtle racism before, microaggressions cloaked in politeness, but this was different. This was naked, unfiltered prejudice, laid bare for all to see. Keanu's eyes narrowed, the first sign of emotion breaking through his calm exterior. He took a step closer to Bradley, his voice dropping just enough to send a shiver through the room. "You need to leave," he said, the quiet authority in his tone impossible to ignore. "Now." Bradley's guest tugged on his sleeve, whispering urgently, "Let's just go. This isn't worth it." For a moment it seemed as though Bradley might resist. His mouth opened, likely to deliver another tirade, but the weight of the room's collective judgment seemed to settle over him. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his face flushed a deeper red. "This place is a joke," he muttered, grabbing his coat and storming toward the exit. His guest followed closely, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving a tense silence in their wake. The room burst into applause. Daniel, still standing at his post, felt his chest tighten as an unexpected wave of emotion surged through him. He'd spent years brushing off moments like these, pretending they didn't matter, but the support from the crowd and the intervention of someone as prominent as Keanu Reeves felt like a validation he hadn't realized he needed. Keanu turned to him, a warm smile breaking through his serious expression. "You okay?" he asked, his tone soft. Daniel nodded, though his voice caught in his throat when he tried to speak. "Why, yeah. Thank you." The applause gradually subsided as diners returned to their meals, the tension in the air giving way to a renewed sense of camaraderie. Peter approached Daniel, his face a mix of apology and pride. "Daniel, I'm so sorry you had to deal with that," he said. "You handled it with more grace than I think I would have." Daniel managed a small smile. "Thanks, Peter. It's just part of the job, I guess." "It shouldn't be," Keanu interjected firmly. "No one should have to endure that." Peter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Agreed. And Daniel, dinner's on the house tonight. Go grab something from the kitchen when you're ready." Daniel hesitated, then nodded gratefully. "Thanks, Peter." As the crowd settled, Keanu returned to his seat. Daniel approached him hesitantly, unsure if he should say more. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine emotion. Keanu waved a hand dismissively. "You don't need to thank me. You handled that better than most people could. I just did what anyone should." "Not everyone would have stepped in like that," Daniel replied. "It means a lot." Keanu smiled, his eyes kind. "Well, if it helps, I'll be back here next week. Hopefully for a quieter dinner." Daniel chuckled despite himself. "We'll make sure of it." As the night continued, the restaurant buzzed with a renewed energy. Patrons who had remained quiet earlier made a point to thank Daniel for his service, and Maria gave him an exaggerated thumbs up from across the room. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt seen not just for his work but for his worth. He didn't know if Keanu realized how much his actions had meant, but he vowed to carry the moment with him, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, dignity and kindness could triumph. The restaurant staff had regained their rhythm, the sounds of clinking cutlery and quiet conversation gradually overtaking the earlier tension. Yet whispers lingered, and diners exchanged excited glances. Many stole subtle looks at Keanu, still seated at his corner table, enjoying his meal as though nothing unusual had happened. Daniel, however, found it hard to move past the events of the evening. Every step he took through the dining room felt heavy with the memory of Bradley's words. Maria approached Daniel near the service station, her expression one of cautious encouragement. "You okay?" she asked, gently touching his shoulder. Daniel nodded, though his smile was faint. "I think so. Just processing." Maria smiled warmly. "You did good tonight. Don't let that guy get to you. And hey, Keanu freaking Reeves just had your back. That's one for the books." Daniel let out a small chuckle. Yeah, it's not every day you get defended by a movie star. The two shared a brief laugh before Maria was called away to a table. Daniel turned back to his own responsibilities, determined to finish the night strong. As he approached Keanu's table to clear away empty plates, he noticed the actor watching him intently. "Busy night," Keanu said, his voice low but kind. Daniel hesitated before responding, unsure of how to balance professionalism with his gratitude. "That's one way to put it. Thank you again for stepping in earlier. I didn't expect." Keanu waved off the thanks, his expression earnest. "You shouldn't have had to expect anything. What happened was wrong, and you handled yourself with a lot of grace." Daniel felt his throat tighten. He'd spent years navigating situations like this, always telling himself that staying calm was the only way to endure. Hearing someone with Keanu's presence acknowledge that effort felt strangely overwhelming. "I've seen my share of moments like that," Keanu continued, leaning back in his chair. "People think money or status gives them the right to treat others like they're less than human. It doesn't, ever." Daniel nodded slowly, taking in the sincerity of Keanu's words. "I've dealt with guys like him before. You get used to it, I guess." "You shouldn't have to," Keanu replied simply. "No one should." As Daniel cleared the table, Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. "Can I ask you for a favor?" Daniel blinked, startled. "Of course, anything." Keanu took out a crisp stack of bills, far more than what his modest meal had cost, and handed it to Daniel. "Split this among the staff," he said. "Everyone here worked hard tonight, and they deserve to feel appreciated." Daniel's eyes widened. "This is way too much. I don't even know if I can." "Trust me," Keanu said, smiling faintly. "It's not too much. You and your team earned it." Daniel hesitated but eventually nodded, taking the money with a quiet thank you as he walked back toward the kitchen, the weight in his chest began to lift. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such kindness, especially in a setting where he so often felt invisible. In the kitchen, Maria was the first to spot him. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the money in his hand. "Keanu wanted to tip everyone," Daniel explained, holding up the cash. "Said we earned it." Maria let out a low whistle. "That man's a saint." The news spread quickly among the staff, lifting spirits in a way that Daniel hadn't expected. For the first time that night, he felt a sense of camaraderie rather than the isolation he often experienced after incidents like Bradley's. Keanu's gesture wasn't just generous, it was a reminder that their work mattered, even when some patrons failed to see it. As the evening wound down, Daniel found himself lingering near Keanu's table once more. The actor was finishing his dessert, his demeanor as relaxed as ever. "Heading out soon?" Daniel asked, feeling bolder now. Keanu nodded, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "Yeah, early morning tomorrow. But I'll definitely be back." Daniel grinned. "I'll make sure we have your favorite table ready." Keanu chuckled. "I'll hold you to that." Before leaving, Keanu stood and extended his hand. Daniel hesitated for a split second before taking it, his grip firm despite the lingering nerves. "Thanks again," Daniel said, his voice steady. "Not just for me, for all of us." Keanu gave him a reassuring nod. "You're welcome. And don't forget what you do here, the way you handle yourself, it matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Keanu left, the restaurant seemed to exhale collectively, the evening settling into a calmer rhythm. Daniel returned to his station, the weight in his chest replaced by something lighter. He glanced around at his co-workers, Maria cracking jokes, the chefs laughing in the kitchen, and felt, for the first time that night, a sense of pride. The restaurant had begun to empty, with only a few tables still occupied. The staff moved with a different energy, now lighter, more relaxed thanks to Keanu's generous gesture. The buzz of the earlier drama had faded into a warm hum of camaraderie among the workers, each finding renewed purpose in the job that often felt thankless. Daniel, still processing the events of the evening, leaned against the service station for a moment, watching Maria at a nearby table. She was chatting with a couple, her laughter carrying easily over the soft classical music playing in the background. It wasn't just the money Keanu had left, it was the way he had reminded all of them that their work mattered, that they deserved respect. Peter, the manager, approached Daniel with a clipboard in hand, his usual serious expression softened by a rare smile. "I just finished going through the evening's numbers," he said, "and I wanted to say thank you for how you handled things earlier. It couldn't have been easy." Daniel straightened, brushing off the compliment with a small shrug. "It's part of the job, I guess." Peter frowned slightly. "It shouldn't be. And it won't be, at least not here. I'm making some changes to our customer service policy. From now on, if someone treats any of my staff the way Bradley did, they'll be asked to leave immediately." Daniel blinked, surprised. "Really? You don't think that'll cause issues?" Peter shook his head. "The only issue would be letting people think they can treat others like that. Keanu's right, respect isn't negotiable, and it's about time we started enforcing that." Daniel felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: hope. For so long, he'd accepted the idea that enduring mistreatment was just part of his job. Hearing Peter say otherwise felt like a step towards something better, not just for him, but for everyone who worked here. "Thanks, Peter," Daniel said, his voice quieter than he intended. "That means a lot." Peter gave him a firm nod before heading back to his office. Daniel stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle into something calmer, more manageable. As the last few customers paid their bills and departed, Maria sidled up to him, her grin wide. So she said, elbowing him lightly, "What's it like being the star of tonight's biggest drama?" Daniel chuckled, rolling his eyes. "I'd rather not be, honestly. But it turned out okay, I guess." "Okay," Maria said, feigning outrage. "You were defended by John Wick. That's better than okay." Daniel shook his head, unable to suppress his smile. "Fine, it was better than okay." They both laughed, the tension of the night dissolving into a shared sense of triumph. In the kitchen, the rest of the staff had gathered around a small table, where the head chef, Lewis, was dividing up Keanu's tip. The room buzzed with excitement as each person received their share, the atmosphere more festive than anyone had expected for a typical Tuesday night. Luis waved Daniel over. "You're part of this too, you know," he said, holding out an envelope. Daniel hesitated. "I didn't do anything special. Keanu's the one who—" "Nah," Luis interrupted, shaking his head. "You kept your cool when most people wouldn't have. You stood there, took it, and handled it like a pro. That's worth more than you think." The staff murmured their agreement, and Daniel finally stepped forward. Taking the envelope with a murmured thank you, he glanced inside, his eyes widening at the amount. It wasn't just the money, it was the acknowledgement, the recognition that his efforts mattered. As he slipped the envelope into his pocket, he looked around the room at his coworkers. Maria raised her glass in a mock toast, and the others followed suit, their smiles genuine. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like he was part of something bigger, a team that valued him not just for what he did, but for who he was. The night ended quietly, with the staff cleaning up and preparing for the next day. As Daniel wiped down the last of the tables, he found himself replaying the events of the evening in his mind. Bradley's words had stung, but they no longer felt like a weight he had to carry. Instead, he felt lighter, buoyed by the support of his coworkers and the unexpected kindness of a stranger. Before heading out, Daniel paused by the restaurant's front door, glancing back at the empty dining room. It looked different somehow, not just a place of work, but a space where something important had happened. "Ready to go," Maria called, jingling her keys. Daniel turned, nodding. "Yeah, let's call it a night." As they stepped into the cool evening air, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. The night hadn't just been about enduring prejudice, it had been about reclaiming dignity, about standing tall in the face of injustice. And as he walked toward his car, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on his nightstand. He groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. Texts, missed calls, and social media notifications filled his phone far more than he was used to. "Maria must have tagged me in another meme," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. But as he opened his messages, he froze. A link to a viral video sat at the top of his notifications. The subject line read, "Keanu Reeves stands up for black waiter in viral restaurant incident." His stomach flipped as he tapped on the video. There in crisp HD was the moment Keanu had intervened, his calm but firm presence diffusing the situation with Bradley. The caption on the post read, "Kindness costs nothing, but it means everything." Daniel stared at the screen in disbelief. The video had been uploaded just hours ago but already had hundreds of thousands of views, with comments flooding in from around the world. Some praised Keanu's actions, calling him a hero. Others expressed outrage at Bradley's behavior and applauded Daniel's professionalism. Scrolling through the comments, Daniel felt an odd mix of emotions. There was gratitude for the outpouring of support, but also a strange vulnerability in being thrust into the spotlight. He had spent years trying to avoid attention, focusing on doing his job well and keeping his head down. Now he was the subject of conversations he never intended to spark. Before he could process it further, his phone buzzed with a call. It was Peter, the restaurant manager. "Daniel, have you seen it?" Peter's voice was uncharacteristically animated. "Yeah, just now," Daniel replied, still dazed. "This is huge," Peter continued. "We've been getting calls all morning, media outlets, journalists, even a few local news stations. They all want to talk to you." Daniel's pulse quickened. "Me? Why?" "Because you handled yourself like a pro, and now people want to know your story," Peter said. "I've already had to turn down a couple of interviews. I wanted to check with you first before saying anything." Daniel hesitated, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be at the center of this attention. "I'll need some time to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Peter said. "Take all the time you need. Just know we've got your back." After hanging up, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the video still playing on his phone. The comments continued to pour in, each one amplifying the weight of what had happened. While he appreciated the support, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger, about respect, dignity, and the way people treated one another. Later that afternoon, Daniel decided to head into work early. The restaurant felt different as he walked through the door, the usual hustle and bustle tinged with an air of anticipation. Maria was already there, polishing glasses at the bar. "Look who's famous," she teased, flashing him a grin. Daniel groaned. "Don't remind me." "Seriously, though," Maria said, her tone softening, "you deserve this. People are finally seeing what we go through every day. And you handled it better than anyone else could have." Daniel managed a small smile. "Thanks, Maria. It still feels strange, though." "It'll pass," she said, patting his shoulder. "Just enjoy the moment." As the dinner shift began, patrons trickled in, many of them casting curious glances at Daniel. A few even approached him to express their support. One woman, an older diner who had witnessed the incident, stopped him as he brought out her meal. "You were remarkable last night," she said, her voice warm. "I hope you know that what you did mattered." Daniel thanked her, feeling a swell of pride tempered by humility. The night continued smoothly, with an air of respect and camaraderie that hadn't been there before. Toward the end of the evening, the door swung open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Keanu Reeves, dressed casually in a leather jacket and jeans, greeted the hostess with a small nod. The room fell quiet as heads turned, diners whispering in excitement. Keanu scanned the room until his eyes landed on Daniel, who froze mid-step. With a faint smile, Keanu approached him. "Hey," Keanu said, his tone as relaxed as if they were old friends. "Mind if I sit in your section again?" Daniel chuckled, gesturing to an empty table. "Of course, welcome back." As Daniel brought over a glass of water, Keanu leaned back in his chair, observing the room. "Looks like things are calmer tonight." "They are," Daniel agreed. "Thanks to you." Keanu shook his head. "Don't give me too much credit. All I did was say what needed to be said. You're the one who set the example." They shared a quiet moment, the weight of the evening before still lingering in the air. Finally, Keanu spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You know," he said, "you could use this moment to make a difference. If you're willing, I think people would listen." Daniel nodded slowly, his thoughts churning. Maybe he could speak up not just about what happened, but about the larger issues it represented. For the first time, the idea didn't feel so daunting. As Keanu finished his meal and prepared to leave, he shook Daniel's hand firmly. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and don't underestimate the power of your voice." "I won't," Daniel replied, his grip steady. "Thank you for everything." As the door closed behind Keanu, Daniel stood for a moment, letting the gravity of the day sink in. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he felt ready to face it. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen or undervalued. That night, as the restaurant lights dimmed and the staff cleaned up, Daniel couldn't help but smile. The world might not change overnight, but sometimes all it took was one voice, one moment to spark something bigger. And for the first time, he felt ready to be that voice.